Thank you very much all for coming. Our guest doesn't really need any introduction. He's been a minister. He was first appointed a minister 40 years ago this year, can you believe it? He's on his 6th cabinet post, his 4th Tory Prime Minister. He was a member of the House of Commons before David Cameron was even at primary school, I think. So you must have been thrilled.
Remember the House of Commons before George Osborne was born, not George Osborne.
You must have been thrilled when the reshuffle was the new generation reshuffle, and you were a key part of that.
Well, I actually thought I was going to leave the government, but it's the umpteenth reshuffle I've been engaged in, so I was rather pleased to find I was still in it. But as you say, it does get, well, I don't normally go on about it because it underlines the fact I'm a survivor from a different generation. But yes, I'm now, I think, surrounded by a wholly different generation of people who weren't in politics when I started, and it's an unusual sensation. I always say at least the quality of my contribution, the quantity of my contribution to public life isn't in doubt. The quality is highly debatable and it can be controversial, but I've been in office for longer at least than anybody else.
I love the way there's no compromise with modern technology in your case. So I think, didn't number 10 try to give you a BlackBerry? You immediately gave it back.
Yes, when I was persuaded to come back on the front bench, I was told I had to carry a BlackBerry, and I tried it for 6 months, and it was a complete waste of time. I probably couldn't work it properly, really, so I handed it back, and it was very useful with the cricket score. Once the cricket season was over, I couldn't see what on earth it was for.
Do you actually have a mobile phone at all now?
I have a mobile phone in my pocket. It is switched off. I always say if you switch it on, people keep ringing you up, and I can't. I use it, switch it on, when I want to make an outgoing phone call. And my children, who say I should not carry on in this way and should keep it secret, in fact, I've never really adopted modern technology, tell me it's about to go to a museum, because I can't see the need to keep changing my mobile phone.
So no iPads, no Facebook?
No, none of those things.
And what do you think of Twitter? Because actually there is a lot of politicians now are using Twitter as a sort of serious political tool.
Well, I've never persuaded to take up Twitter, and I mean, I am making myself sound like a ludicrous old fogey. I just have never, I can't understand how people have the time for it. It seems to be an extraordinary way of spending time. And it's obviously very dangerous for politicians and celebrities of all kinds. It's footballers and politicians forever putting daft things on Twitter. And then having to deny that they've done it or claim they've been drinking at the time, whatever it is. And if I carry on, somebody in the audience will explode with rage because everybody in the 50s takes a totally different view. But I have not switched on to it. It strikes me as a light and superficial way of spending a great deal of time communicating huge numbers of people you don't really know. Occasionally my staff print out blogs for me to read, and the representation of extremist and crackpot people is, in amongst all sensible people, is disproportionate, it seems to me.
So David Cameron's just signed onto Twitter.
But if I'm meant to sign on in any way to, I haven't done that. I wouldn't know how to receive his twittering. I think a lot of people in my generation just decide it's not worth taking up. It's slightly difficult to see the point. But my children are deeply ashamed of me. And they're middle-aged, involved in any of this. And I have other darker theories, which I won't go on, because they really are things when I start slightly tongue-in-cheek, producing all kinds of black humour about modern IT and its catastrophic effect on modern officers and all the rest of it. And I have not really tuned into it. I wish the email would be disinvented, because the amount of stuff I get bombarded with is almost impossible for me, particularly in my small constituency staff, to handle. It's so easy to send things by email. Mountains of rubbish and routine lobbying bury the stuff you actually want on the email. I think everybody has this experience. I resent that my staff waste hours of their day piling through. I can't download even. But they plough through all this rubbish, and we're trying to find things we need, that we're looking for.
But what's fascinating is that although you don't have all the modern techniques, you still have a sort of authenticity, and people like the way your style and the way you speak. You're authentic in a way. But there is a sort of wider.
That's very kind of you. I can't even say an authentic what, but on this I'm a bit of a museum.
But there's a wider loss of trust in politics, isn't there? Which, if you think of since you started as an MP all those years ago, What do you think has caused that? Is it just, it's more than the MP's expense, isn't it? Politicians seem less willing to speak their minds. There are more spin doctors trying to control everything, and grids and media strategies, etc.
Yes. It's very worrying. We haven't come to terms with what's modern technology, with modern media and its impact on politics. And, to be more serious, because I'm sure my views again are affect politicians of my generation, you can't reverse it. It's all changed. The biggest single change, first of all, is the constant campaigning. Politicians, when I started, did not think they were fighting an election every day of the week. And it's the change in the media moving from just being reporters of events, the Times being the great newspaper of record and all that kind of thing, to all the newspapers being campaigning. I mean, Murdoch introduced it. And so you have 24 hours, 7 days a week, this slightly hysterical level of constant campaigning. And we don't have problems anymore. We don't have policy issues. We have crises, we have scandals, we have debats, and we have instant reaction all the time to it all.
There's always something gate.
Yeah, and in a way, it gets ever more frantic. The politics has got drawn into the celebrity culture and the cult of the personality, and it's kind of associated with not just media but show business. It's very much the same style. And then we've attracted from America this army of people. They're not all Americans, but they're mostly their trade in America, who are media advisors and campaign managers and public relations people who we never used to have. I remember when I went to America, Americans who were making a fortune out of this rubbish over there were trying to work out how to get into the British market. And I said, you won't get anywhere. We can't advertise on television, and there's a spending limit of 7,000 in the constituency. And they thought we were obviously mad. Well, we've still got some of the spending limits, but parties spend millions and millions of pounds on all this stuff.
And
it leads the public to engage in this kind of extraordinary, it gives the impression of a constantly frenzied debate. And the public are more demanding, but less involved. They get very, very annoyed if they themselves don't get pretty quickly gratified by what the politicians do. And of course, the personality clashes and all the rest of it, and the negative campaigning rapidly give the idea they're all scoundrels and hopeless, and it's all their fault. And governments get involved in things that used to regard as having nothing to do with the government. The government now has reached a thing, and the members' expenses came on the top of that. And now we've reached a depth of cynicism about the practice of politics, which is very dangerous for a modern democracy. People won't vote, they won't take at face value what anybody says. Sometimes they're quite right, because a lot of the campaigning is superficial rubbish on all sides. We've got to learn. It's no good my saying it was a golden age. I was a pretty unscrupulous campaigning when I started, but we've got to learn somehow how to live with this.
Do you think politicians need to speak their minds more? Because you're the sort of spin doctor's nightmare now. I mean, I remember last time I interviewed you, you suddenly started rambling on about sadomasochism and 50 Shades of Grey, and the spin doctors started telling
you got the wrong guy there. Well, if you want, but no, I've never read it. Well, honestly, I do think that. I mean, the first efforts, primitive efforts, looking back, to bring in the line to take, was in John's government, John Major's government, and the idea we should all use the same form of words and all use the same phrase. I was Chancellor of the Exchequer by then, so I treated all this with total scorn. I think John Prescott and I, on our respective sides, were a complete nightmare for people trying to bring these daft American techniques into British politics. And I do, but whether that's wise, I'm not sure. I do have an inner control. I do believe in party government. I do believe in party discipline. I think it's the only way to produce strong government out of, the anarchic disorder of the range of public opinion. I think collective responsibility is essential. But I prefer to dilate in my own way and argue in my own way the cases I want to argue. And I think the public like it, but I think it drives spin doctors completely and utterly up the wall.
Now, Boris is walking an uneasy tightrope on this one, isn't he? Because he's the anti-politics politician in a way. The people love him because he's not conventional. But do you think he's loyal? Do you think he's kind of hamming up?
Oh, I think he's loyal. I think he's more out of control than me. I mean, somebody likes Boris. The Boris mania here is he's gone now. People are wondering 2 or 3 days' time what it was all about. And I began to wonder what it was all about. I'm not sure Boris knew what it was all about. It was the media had got nothing to report. And Boris is terrific. I listened to his speech. He was Boris, and it was more scripted than he was letting on, but he's got all the Borisisms in it. And I think he faced a problem when he arrived. He'd set off all this thing. He's not bidding for the leadership. If he is, he's a complete idiot. There isn't a vacancy at the moment. He can't keep up Boris mania for the next 3 years and sweep out David Cameron when and if David Cameron becomes vulnerable to be swept out. This is all nonsense. He must know that. So I thought the speech this morning, given he'd set all this off by accident, was very skilled.
Accidentally on purpose, I think.
I don't think he said. I think he liked the excitement of setting. I don't. What was he for? But the speech this morning was very good. He was a very perfectly good speech, but he didn't say anything silly. He just talked about London, just jokes. It was fine, and it's gone again.
Do you think he'd be a good
But as you say, there's obviously the whole thing was not designed by any clever spin doctor. It was all a completely Boris phenomenon, sort of passing through and going away again.
Do you think he'd be a good Prime Minister, or do you think he's more of an opposition?
I'm not going to start offering an opinion on that. You're trying to get me to go into areas which Boris very wisely eventually had the sense to realise he should avoid. He might. I don't know. I think he's a great entertainer. He's a huge public personality. And if he wants to be Prime Minister, he's entitled. Most politicians want to be Prime Minister. I wanted to be Prime Minister. I didn't make a secret of it. One of my bad habits was standing for the leadership of the party all the time. But he's got to try. I mean, he's got a quite solid track record of some kind. People know he's an entertainer. They think he's a nice guy and he's much loved and all that. But the British, unless they've got very cynical, when push comes to shove, they're very earnest about their politics. They tend to want to vote for serious people. They look at the people we have got at the top and think, are they prime ministerial material? One of David's strengths is he looks and sounds like a prime minister. And Ed Miliband is trying to look and sound like a prime minister. And Boris has got to do it his own way, with his own style. But personally, I wouldn't bother at the moment. There was going to be a vacancy for years. But if he wants sometime in the future to have a go, he'd have a think about how you're going to look and sound like a prime minister, and how you're going to demonstrate you've got some executive skills and can run something. But it's this party conference 2012. This is all ephemeral nonsense, as Boris must realise. No one's going to be prime minister apart from David Cameron before 2015. And if he wins, he will carry on being prime minister after 2015.
Do you think the whole perception that David Cameron is chillaxing too much is a problem, or do you think actually politicians should chillax and relax and switch off? You got photographed at the cricket with your shoes off the other day.
Well, I don't know why. It's again. I'm sounding as though I don't have a total down on the way of modern politics. It's quite fun the way it's reported, but I can't quite understand why David gets criticised for chillaxing. And I may be deceiving myself. So far as I can see, nobody bothers a tuppenny damn about my being sprawled out on the balcony at Trentbridge, sticking a foot from which I have unwisely taken my shoe through the railings. It's how many people do it. Gordon Brown was a paranoid workaholic, and if I'd been a friend, I'm not quite friendly in terms of Gordon, but not so he'd speak to me most of the time. And if I'd given him friendly advice, I'd say, Gordon, what you need is to go away on holiday for a week, get to bed and have a proper night's sleep, and try and find something other than politics for an hour or two.
So chillaxing is good, all politicians do compulsory chillaxing.
I mean, Gordon, I used to get worried about Gordon's general state of health and state of mind when he was at work. I'm not saying but he was under such, he was obviously under tremendous stress and behaving in this curious and suspicious way, and he was supposed to be Prime Minister.
And the other thing that's changed since you came in is the Tory party must have changed enormously. Do you think if you were now choosing which party to join, you'd be in the Tory party, or do you think actually you might look at the Lib Dems, or because actually the younger generation of Tories who are coming through are quite different kinds.
They are different. I mean, I was in my generation. We were all captured by the Conservative Party. I mean, most students are left wing. It's meant to be very, very worrying if you wind up being Conservative when you're student. I mean, how right-wing are you going to be when you're older? People are. We all became conservatives, but that was the generation of Butler, MacLeod, One Nation conservatism, modernising the country, getting away from the awful post-war legacy, finding a role in the world, joining Europe, all these things.
So would you
we were a very political generation at university, and practically all my friends who were engaged in political activity at university all became Conservative MPs, and none of the Labour ones, none of the Liberal ones. So we really recruited the university generation into the Conservative Party. It was different. And now it's modernisers, Camerons, modernisers, they're moderates, they're centre-ground politicians, but it's just a different style, different agenda.
So
it's a different world and different campaigning.
Would you join the Tory party now if you were a student?
Well, since I wouldn't join the, New Labour would not have attracted me, and I also regard the Liberals as, you only got to see a Liberal assembly to understand why you haven't joined them. They are, although all three political parties all three political parties have occasionally gone through affairs over the years, always, not particularly recently, where any one of them would have put anybody off joining them if you'd stood at the back of their party conference at the wrong moment. It's always quite a problem. No, I don't think I find either of the other too attractive. And so I continue to be free-market economics, social conscience, modernising is still a word I like to use, internationalism, particularly with making sure we get involved properly and get marginalised the European Union. They're my views. Now, I think that takes me, keeps me in the Conservative Party, and I think some of the Liberals, or in coalition with us, one or two of them, not all of them, not Vince, who I've known since he was a student, he's always been a Social Democrat, but I think one or two of the others, who I won't name, in my opinion, ought to be Conservatives. They are Conservative, and the only reason they joined the Liberal Democrats was we went through a particularly manic Eurosceptic phase, and they're all pro-European, so they switched off.
Do you think Nick Clegg's a secret Tory?
He denies it, but we only tease each other. We have a kind of black humour, so I don't want to get it, if anybody starts thinking it up and take it too seriously. The fact is, he's the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, and I've been a Conservative I became a Conservative when I was a student, so for very, very many years, just several decades. But we each tease each other. And he gives me a sort of Dadstonian philosophy, and I tell him more about free market economics and formal social services. Neither of us has got anywhere near converting the other. But I always point out that when I first met him, he was stagiaire, which is European for political aid, to my old friend Leon Britton. And Leon was a commissioner in Brussels. And I think if I asked myself what's Nick Clegg going to do, I'd said he's going to become a Conservative MP. And he turns up as a Liberal MEP in my party.
Do you think David Cameron's a One Nation Tory in your tradition, or is he a different
He's a One Nation Tory in the Cameroon moderniser tradition. Okay. But I mean, we are getting into theology here, which I normally, it's like, I'm not quite... I occasionally have thought, because people have asked me this question once or twice I got into all this not long ago on a television programme. There is a it's just a generational thing. The One Nation Tories of the era that, the people were all in Thatcher's cabinet, the young members of Thatcher's cabinet, we're not quite the same somehow as the Cameroons, but we are, I mean, in the centre ground of politics, and you've got to listen to Michael Gove today. His social conscience is just as acutely tuned as any of my friends that I came into politics with, and we certainly now, free market economics, we're trying to keep up with the rapidly changing nature of modern economy, so it's all really the same. But the agenda's slightly different.
Do you worry that Cameron's almost giving in too much to the right wingers sometimes, that he's feeling weak and so he's moving in that direction?
We have this man management problem. The leader of the Conservative Party, I would have faced it in spades if I've ever won any mileage. Also the problem with the very broad church, which we've always acknowledged the Conservative Party is, of man management, trying to keep the factions under control. And everybody who's led the Conservative Party for the last 150 years has had trouble with the Conservative right, apart from the one or two who've led it from the right. We've only ever had a couple who've done that, 3 perhaps. And the Conservative Party has been the most powerful political party in the world and the longest lived. And it's been riddled with dissension ever since it started, but it's an extremely effective governing party. Modern Conservatism was founded by Sir Robert Peel, and his Cabinet manifesto, more on about history, is the origin of what is now the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party certainly got rid of him pretty thoroughly after about 10 years. He was dispatched into the outer darkness, and it happened to a lot of others. And it's usually a tussle with the right, but then Lord Salisbury led him to the right, and Margaret Thatcher led him to the right. So.
But do you worry that Cameron is drifting too far in that direction?
He's a leader of a party, and he's got considerable political skills in keeping everybody in one place, and he made us electable. The worst, I mean, the Conservative Party, we had several leaders of the Conservative Party who had appeared when the Conservative Party, which rather took for granted that we were the natural governing party of the country, and we always formed the government. Suddenly we were incapable of winning an election. Actually, we haven't won one for 20 years. And the main reason was we were having a ferocious and daft civil war. And despite all the best efforts of the leader of the party, a sort of ferocious, noisy nonsense was coming out of the party all the time. And David stopped that. I would remind you, one of the things he did when he became party was tell us all to stop going on about Europe. Didn't want to know what our feelings were on Europe. Would we please? Perfectly serious, very important subject. But would we not give the impression that the Conservative Party thought of nothing else? It was lying awake at night screaming about the problems of Europe because we were putting people off. And he's gone back to very skilled man management, kind he has to do, keep the broad church together, which deserves to win an election, should win an election, unless we start giving ourselves up to funny factional fighting again, which I'm certainly not, and people in the government are. We're very pragmatic, rather successful cabinet.
Do you ever feel relieved that you've got Lib Dems in the cabinet, because that gives you cover?
Yeah, we have a range of views in the cabinet, and sort of. And the one thing I always decline to do is start saying which of my colleagues I think are wet, which are dry, whatever. The Conservative Party always has slogans at any given time. It divides itself up. Wets are fought dries.
But at least for the Lib Dems,
One Nation Tories have fought others. We've been pro-Europeans and Eurosceptics for as long as... Remember, I say I could take you back to Robert Peel with exactly the same thing. Protectionists or...
But does it help you, your wing of the party, having the Liberal Democrats in the government, do you think?
Well, it does a bit, because I am on some things. The Liberal Democrats have, the Liberal Democrat Parliamentary Party and a lot of its followers are, of course, seething with rage. As the Liberal Democrats in the cabinet have had to persuade their people to do all kinds of things which, as no Liberal Democrat came into politics in order to be in the governing party in the first place, they didn't have the slightest intention of ever signing up to. So they have exactly the same problems. I think Nick has terrible troubles with his grandees and his backbenchers. And so on some subjects, we don't always divide on party lines in the cabinet, in the sense we don't divide. Much more cohesive than the major cabinet was. But when we do have difference of opinions, it isn't always strictly between the two parties. There are some things, most obviously Europe, where I am, pretty close to the Liberals. Other things where I'm not, and where I have to go along with our doing things because the Liberals have got to do it, because there's a point beyond which where their members won't put up with doing things and keeping on board unless we give them that coalition. One, I find it very interesting. I've not done this before. I didn't think the British could work coalitions. But this is very good. It's helpful. The government can achieve far more in coalition than it could if we managed to win a tiny majority. It would have been a disaster. We couldn't have delivered half the things we've delivered. And if you win a majority, you've got to win a damn good majority to go through a crisis. As John Major discovered, he hadn't got a majority to do anything by the time he eventually fell. So the coalition, I'm a strong supporter of the coalition. And on some things it's helpful to have Liberals, because on some things I'm no nearer to some of the Liberals than I am to some of the others. But we don't work like that. Again, it's all part of... David Cameron introduced this to the party. When he took over, it was a kind of instant success, because he just stopped indulging in all this stuff that had been going on before. And he got everybody to take an extremely pragmatic approach. The coalition works on the basis that we don't just sit there talking to each other as Liberal Democrats and Conservatives. We take a pragmatic approach to what needs to be done to deliver our principal agenda, which is the path to economic recovery, and it has worked well.
But why is it that successive Tory leaders end up kind of pandering to the right? Is that wing just so powerful?
Because they're very noisy. And they've always had the press on their side. I mean, we're going to safe ground. Baldwin had terrible trouble with Rothermere and Northcliffe and all the rest of it. And so his right wing, who were completely balmy, constantly put in peril the Conservatives' continued hold on power. We're always wound up by their newspapers, which were extreme in their advocacy of what they thought should be done. I mean, why should I be quite so open to the Conservative audience? The Labour Party's had the same trouble with its hard left for as long as I can remember. Right? Good to see Len McCluskey back. It makes one makes one nostalgic to see the kind of people who kept the Labour Party out of power for most of the time of my lifetime. And I trust they will continue to do so again.
But do you think things like crime, being tough on crime and law and order are a vote winner? That's what a lot of people say.
Depends how you're tough on crime and law and order. What matters is whether, obviously, it's extremely, the most serious responsibility of any governing party is to keep society safe and secure. The last Times populace poll, if you look it up, showed that the subject on which we were standing highest was keeping down crime, and it was the only subject upon which the government's ratings were rising very rapidly. So anybody starts querying my period of office, I had quite a good long run in justice, longer than I had in most of the other jobs I found, but came out on quite a high, really. But Theresa and I, in our blend of things, have produced any subject matter which we didn't seem to be declining.
Well, Theresa used to joke that she locked them up, you let them out, but now apparently
she did on the famous occasion, yes, that's right.
She locks them up and Chris Grayling throws away the keys.
Well, the Labour Party divided the departments in a very funny way, so some of those tensions are inevitable. When they sacked Derry Irvine, got rid of the old Lord Chancellor's department, broke up the Home Office and divided the two departments, and Tony Blair was ever reorganising departments and giving them silly names. So you had a Constitutional Affairs department for a bit, and then a Justice department and a Home Office, which is much smaller than the old Home Office I was last in 20 years ago, and when we used to have this giant, all-embracing Home Office. Now, she's got MI5, police, everything to do with security, and the Justice Department's got courts, prisons, and everything to do with justice and lawyers, legal aid, lawyers, and sentencing and reform and so on. So the two are rather divided into the hardline end and the sort of slightly softline end. And
Chris Grayling seems to be more on the hardline side, though, or at least that's what he said. Chris presents things different to me. I'm sure actually. I don't think there's actually can be all that much difference in what actually done. But it's a very interesting time to be handling all these things. I mean, when I say it's been divided oddly, I wouldn't have done it that way. But I would also strongly advise nobody to reopen it. Not at the moment, because, as I already said, you never achieve very much by reorganising all the departments and giving them silly names and moving everything about. You find it, whatever you do, much better to get on with it, with the structure you've got. So are you pleased that Cameron's gone from hugging hoodies to bashing burglars?
Don't think he has, but that's something all part of modern reporting of politics.
Well, this announcement today...
He never hugged a hoodie. That was a brilliant... The Labour MP who devised that is a constituent of mine and a friend of mine. He's a good guy. He was Home Office Minister. But Vernon, it's one piece of Vernon Coker brilliance. Anna knows Vernon, another Nottinghamshire MP. He turned a perfectly sensible liberal speech into hug a hoodie.
But he is now bashing burglars, isn't he?
No, I don't think he's ever used that phrase.
But he's saying, do you think it's a good idea to change the law so you can have disproportionate force to bash a burglar?
Well, the problem with the law on self-defence is that there's a constant public concern that it isn't strong enough. There's a kind of incessant campaign that the law is somehow disadvantageous and that innocent householders can't defend themselves. So the last Act of Parliament that I took through had a clearer statement of the law of self-defence. We've made several efforts at it.
So you think it's not necessary to do it again?
What's been proposed is fine, it's okay. I actually think we've mainly aimed at reassuring the public that the circumstances being described would not give rise to anybody being prosecuted for being frightened and reacting in a way which turns out to injure or kill the burglar when you're actually in a state of terror because you've got somebody in the house. That is the law. And what we're really trying to do is reassure the general public
so is it necessary
the law
to
is
change
sensible.
the law again then? Since it was
Well, from the way it's been greeted, it's obvious that some of the newspapers still need to be persuaded that the law is as the law is. Seems to, when I was,
so the law,
it kept coming
as
up
it
when I
is,
was Justice Secretary. It seemed to me we were having quite a lot of burglars bumped off when I was in office, and we didn't then really prosecute them. But of course they would do if instead of just reacting in panic and terror and doing what any reasonable person, with hindsight, well, they would when they're so frightened and trying desperately to think what to do because they think they're in imminent danger, they're protecting their property. It gets different if you become the aggressor. That's quite clear. If when the burglar's left the house, you chase him round the road and shoot him in the back, I'm afraid you're going to find yourself on trial. And the jury convicted that chap of manslaughter, which is quite generous, really. I think he was convicted of manslaughter, wasn't he?
He was convicted of murder, but then it was overturned and he was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility because he was mad.
Another minister has also been a practicing criminal lawyer and she's practiced more recently than me. I've forgotten the details. But I suppose he wasn't you're not defending yourself once you're shooting someone fleeing from you in the back.
And what about this idea of 2 strikes and you're out for violent crime, which they've also announced today? Is there sort of danger of ramping up the rhetoric and actually this should be a matter for judges rather than for politicians?
In the end, it is for judges. It is for judges. Actually, I didn't know they'd announced that today. It's gone back to the 2 strikes and you're out thing. Well, we've had that before.
Do you think it's a good
Two
idea?
sessions. Well, I think that the level of sentencing is in the end one for judges because the cases are not. Each judge, each case, in the end, doing justice means you look at each case on its merits. Now, of course, Parliament is perfectly entitled, and always has, sets a kind of tariff that indicates the seriousness which the public, represented by Parliament, thinks ought to be reflected. There is always a very powerful public debate, so there should be, whether penalties are adequate. The system reflects that. I've just commented on the fact that I was a criminal lawyer quite a long time, quite a few years ago now. Sentences are much longer now. That's why there are far more people in prison. The level of sentencing that judges impose at the moment is, quite exceeds anything that I would have expected. Quite tough high court judges on the size and recorders to have imposed 30 years ago. They didn't have sentences like that. And so it's.
Do you think they're too tough and actually it's too many?
I think the modern world, the punishment for crime is imprisonment. Quite correctly so. I like everybody else. I think serious criminals, only thing we can do, the most civilized thing we can do, is to apply for their liberty by sending them to prison. And that's fine. I think because we expanded so rapidly, we got some pretty odd things happening. The last Labour government started expanding the population out of all control. Had to start letting them out halfway through the sentence because they've got room for them. Then they wound up at the end of their period of office, Brown Blair government, actually letting people out altogether before they finished the halfway, early, because they'd have banged them in the prisons and couldn't build prisons quickly enough to house them. It was pathetic to populism. But what I was trying to do was have prisons to punish people, try to be better at reforming them. And Chris agrees, Chris Grayling with me, because I know he does, I didn't with him the other night, he's as fervent as I am. We first you imprison them, punish them, and then we make an effort for the ones that are capable of being reformed, making sure the few of them, more of them, are not criminals when they go out. And they're not going to come straight back again. They're not going to have more victims, more crimes. And so I also was going out to tender on all the prisons, opening up the management, getting some private sector alternatives, trying to get some change going in the prisons. So I want prisons to cost less. I want them to reform more of their prisoners. And I want them to have work programs and drug rehabilitation, but that's the principal cause of the crime. There are some encouraging signs. society in the end is not all under the control of government. How many people commit crime? Just to be optimistic, there's not much in the world I'm optimistic about at the moment, but the declining levels of heroin abuse amongst young people are very encouraging. The declining levels of drinking, consumption of alcohol, even by the young, has started to drop quite steadily in recent years. Declining levels of knife crime, which have been falling for some years now. It's just possible that we particularly reinforce if we can have some decent education reforms and skills training and keep up the optimism and the opportunities for young people. It's just possible we might be going to a slightly more law-abiding society. And a lot of those are slightly beyond the control of politicians. It's not anything you can entirely dictate. We had a very lawless phase in this country in the post-war era.
So your rehabilitation revolution is safe with Chris Graham, do you think?
Yeah.
Do you think he's going to bang
Absolutely.
people out?
Have you had Chris here? I assure you. I mean, he would privately, he would publicly. I had conversations with many we were talking about. I was really telling you what I was handing over to him when we had the dinner. We, like two politicians having dinner for the world to rights generally as well. But he would compete with me in his vehemence on the rehabilitation revolution.
Well,
which is the proper phrase I use about it. That was the party's policy, the rehabilitation revolution.
You might disagree with him on the Human Rights Act, because he's saying today a lot of the Human Rights Act, the implications of that are crazy, is his word, and he and Theresa both promised to deal with it and act.
Well, we got a commission studying that. Well, there's a range of views on that. I mean, obviously, we're all in favour of human rights. I mean, obviously, the British wrote the Convention on Human Rights. We can't be just something we think is very good in Burma, but not actually very suitable in the United Kingdom. And so if you want to change it, you've got to say, well, which rights do you wish to drop? Which rights shouldn't the British have? And which rights do you want to give them they haven't got now? And we have a whole learned commission with a very wide range of views on it, studying whether there are alternatives to the Human Rights Act might be possible. But I cannot believe, and other European, members of Western European civilizations will be utterly astonished the British started dropping the concept of human rights. The fact we adhere to it has a huge effect. It gives great hope to liberals in Russia, Azerbaijan, Turkey and places. You know, we require them to comply with these things. We use these international arrangements to try to enforce them upon them. Have the British walk out saying human rights is a kind of soft nonsense that we don't wish to comply with would, I think, cause huge dismay across the rest of Europe. Now, of course, it's got to be sensible. It's got to be applied, both by British courts and by foreign courts, if we accept the jurisdiction of Strasbourg, as we always have. At Strasbourg, we only lose 2% of the cases. We win 98% of the cases.
Do you think
we
the
don't have
judges
many
are too
cases drawn
political,
against
though,
us.
in this country?
No, they're not political. No. But judges must be independent of politics, particularly going back to the style of politics I'm talking about. If you have a wildly media-dominated, frenzied debate all the time, you need a strong, independent judiciary, you need the rule of law, and you need human rights that are enforceable. And I wouldn't accuse any British newspaper of developing a lynch mob mentality amongst the general public, but it must surely always be a risk. And the real problem, the test for a democracy, is not whether you defend the rights of free speech and the liberties of popular people. It is whether you defend the rights and the free speech of unpopular minorities. And that is the real test of a democracy. And so, I mean, the government is actively looking at the framework. That's what I was involved in setting, Nick Clegg and I in the end, but I was the Conservative in setting it up. Set up this convention, but I'm sure it's got a range of views. It's got people on it who've been denouncing the Convention of Human Rights as long as I can remember, and it's got people on the other side of the opinion who want to add some more rights to it. So, but they are seriously studying it, mainly looking at whether the Human Rights Act is the right way of doing it. And I'm dilating at length here in a discussion with a think tank. On the platform, I trust that's where Chris and Theresa in the end would come down. We all agreed to this commission. We're all waiting for the commission's report.
The other area where there are differences of opinion is over the referendum on Europe. Do you think it would be sensible for the Tories to pledge a referendum in the manifesto on being in or out?
I mean, you just draw me in. I don't normally indulge quite as much as my colleagues give my personal views and everything, and I do believe in collective responsibility, but there's no point, everybody knows that I have my views on referenda. So now my colleagues are familiar with them, they kind of put up with the known hostility to referenda and my scepticism, shall I say, if I saw a referendum on Europe, though we're going to wait to see what the subject matter of any debate the referendum is. I'm probably scarred by the last referendum, but the only one we've ever had, which was a complete joke, really. Poor old Harold was trying to control his party and pretended it was all about the terms he'd renegotiated, which everybody ignored. We could quite understand how he thought he'd renegotiated the terms. His cabinet split in two, which caused him huge dismay, and campaigned on both sides. I joined in the campaigning. Very good times had by all. We won, I say, the pro-Europeans, pretty convincingly, and nobody took any notice. The people who demanded the referendum, Tony Benn, had only wanted a referendum because he thought he was going to win it. When he lost it, he lost interest in referenda, and he just carried on being a hardline Eurosceptic, because in those days, Euroscepticism was mainly held by left-wing socialists. And they were the people who were Eurosceptic in my youth. They took no notice. I don't know, perhaps the Eurosceptics, if they lost this time, would all change their views and pretend they become pro-Europeans now. I personally wouldn't myself. Wouldn't make the faintest difference in my opinions without campaign, as I did last time. So we've got to be careful where we're going in all this. But everything requires democratic consent. We are in a democracy. So I've lost elections. I have to put up with governments doing things I don't agree with quite a lot. That's fine. That's all require public consent. But a referendum on whether we're in or out, I've had one of those already, and I just don't quite see the point. And whoever's in power, if you have a referendum on in and out, it will paralyse the government for 12 months while everybody goes in for a vast performance campaign. But I don't think anybody's offering a referendum in or out. So I think that's a particularly weird idea.
The Eurozone is obviously in crisis, but on the economy more generally, you've been through several crises, haven't you? How does this rate compare to the IMF bailout, Black Wednesday? How bad is the situation?
This is of a wholly different order of things. Wholly different order of things. No one's ever been through a financial crisis of this gravity who's alive. I mean, you know, the recession, as you say, end of 80s, 90s was bad enough. And getting out of that, but no. This one is very serious, and this one, because we're now in a global economy, it is global. The entire, all the Western democracies are extremely badly affected and threatened by this one, and it's a global economy. We're very interdependent. The level of debt run up in quite a short time by the folly of bankers and the weakness of regulators is crushing and colossal. It's going to take a very long time to get out of it. So this is quite different to anything. People normally make the comparisons with 1931. You know, is this worse or not? Consequences for populations in most countries are not as bad in 31. A few countries are just as bad, like Greece.
And, do you think Larry King was right when he said that it would be acceptable for George Osborne to miss his fiscal targets because the situation's so bad now?
Well, what we're not acceptable, no one in the government, either Conservative or Liberal, is contemplating is changing the concentration on debt and deficit. And they need to get back to really stick to the task of getting back to a sustainable level.
But these fiscal targets with debt to GDP.
They're always sticking to our fiscal targets, but everybody's trying to get excited about fiscal targets, one of the targets in particular. Because everybody's now changing their economic forecasts. The IMF just have. Well, nobody's surprised by that because everybody else is.
But does it matter if he misses the target or not really?
What matters is if you're changing the fundamentals of the policy.
Right.
I mean, a rather daft debate's going on. Every month we have any figures, people start analysing some particular figure. Monthly figures are pointless. You don't make policy on 1 month's figures. And it's pretty silly, lightweight punditry to take one figure out of it and say it's doing better now or it's doing badly. Forecasts sometimes get reported more excitement than the reality. So of course the forecasts suddenly all start going in one direction because the outlook looks gloomier, and then they go back again. Let's wait to see what our own forecast is in November. Let's 2015, if that's the target you have in mind, let's wait till we're nearer 2015, because I have to honestly, I haven't the faintest idea what the global economy is going to be like in 2015. And if the wisest pundit I know came to me and told me he was certain what the economy was going to be like in 2015, I'd say, well, I'm sorry, I've discovered you're a charlatan. It is complete nonsense that anybody could be certain. So the targets, you have to have targets, you have to have a framework of policy we must stick to in this coalition government. But it's an artificial debate, all this about what are we doing and what are we doing about the target in 2015.
Are you going to be going around with your butcher's axe, helping your colleagues cut as part of your new role? Are you going to be on the Star Chamber?
It was my sad lot when I was Chancellor to have to concentrate a lot on public spending rounds, the Star Chambers. And then when I was in Margaret's cabinet as a young member of the cabinet, I think because I'd been at the bar, I was always roped into Star Chambers to cross-examine my colleagues.
Are you going to do it this time again, do you think?
I might, there's a public, whether it's going to run that way, but there's a public expenditure cabinet committee. But it's a necessity in any democracy, even in ordinary times, that you control public expenditure. It's too easy to buy votes and keep other people's money. And unfortunately, we allowed Gordon Brown to do it for 13 years. You Conservatives believe in sound, prudent economic policy and sustainable fiscal discipline. And I've done it before, so we're there again. But again, it's a new ground. Going back to justice, just briefly, I'm not going to reopen all that again. Justice and Home Office. One of the interesting things, based on Theresa and myself, as I always say, was in my lifetime, no Prime Minister, no party had ever tried to save a penny on anything labelled law and order. We all competed about how much more money we could give to the police, prisons, and every other thing, and legal aid for lawyers, and we all piled on the money. And so Theresa and I had an interesting embark on our respective reforms, taking 23% out of the budget.
There must be more. You must know where the bodies are buried at Justice, don't you, so to speak?
Well, I think that was, I'm afraid I used to use that a bit when I was Chancellor. I have had a much reshuffled career. And the result is there are quite a lot of departments I've been in, so half the time I sit and listen to colleagues making arguments that I faintly recall making to earlier Chancellors of the Exchequer.
So you're going to be tough.
So I've been on both sides of the table. But it's not just being tough. I mean, all this just being tough stuff. I don't really sit here saying this sort of macho stuff as though it's all just a question of being tough or not. It's actually being a question of taking a sensible enough view of the subject and making sure you know more about the subject to be able to make the right decision about degree of you're going to achieve in any particular area. I didn't negotiate the justice budget. I wanted to contribute to deficit reduction. I worked out what I reckon I could manage and told the Treasury, really. I never went to the Star Chamber. I had negotiations with David Cameron and George Osborne were very brief phone conversations. 23%, I reckon I could do it. That's what I signed up for, 23%.
Do you think George Osborne has time to be both Chancellor and the Tories' chief strategist? Because it is a pretty full-time job being Chancellor, isn't it? Any
Chancellor who switches off into politics is an idiot. I mean, Chancellors need to be political strategists.
Hey, does anybody have any questions? Yes, gentlemen.
Can I just say, Minister, because I'm not familiar with the terms, but I'm a bit tired. I've come all the way from the Isle of Wight today to I'm not actually a fully fledged Conservative member. I am a Welsh Conservative, and my name is Andrew Bowen. I've moved to the Isle of Wight, and I was living in South Wales. I'll try and keep it brief because it's a long story to this.
I don't think we've got time for
I'm just going to try and keep it brief.
We've only got another 10 minutes.
Is there any way that an innocent person can defend themselves without actually being arrested and put into custody and have a hearing in a magistrate's court to protect their own innocence? Now you talk about an
Yeah.
unpopular majority, a minority, and I'm actually,
We have a law of self-defence.
because I was actually put in for the 3-minute hearing, and I was an innocent man. So I had to defend myself.
Plenty of innocent people appear in courts and get acquitted.
Yeah, I was after 3 minutes.
The lady over there?
I'm not aware of a false conviction in case of self-defence.
Could we have
In
talk
modern
about it?
times, I can't remember one.
Thank you very much.
Lady.
But I mean, obviously, sometimes people protest their innocence
Think we'll
and
take,
it's found they weren't defending themselves.
Should we take 3 questions at once? The lady over there, and then the gentleman there, and then the gentleman at the back, and then you can answer 3.
Ken, I'm Debbie Ryan, Director of Justice from Working Links. Thank you for coming today. An observation and a question. Observation, I heed your comments on Twitter earlier. Over the summer I ran a hashtag Keep Ken campaign, and No, please don't applause. All I succeeded in doing was eliciting lots of pictures of Barbie and her posable plastic boyfriend. No joy there. But obviously, in your watch, you introduced the Work in Prison campaign. Do you have a message or an opinion on to employers? Really, are they doing enough to get engaged in this agenda? Really, and could they do more? What would it be?
Do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, the work in prison was the area of activity where we made more progress. I was surprised by how quickly we were going. Because the workshops we had were remarkably fewer than they had been 20 years ago when I was last in charge of prisons. Because we got 70 blasted prisoners and there was no space for them anymore. But we got a lot of firms. A lot of big firms were interested. I mean, classic what I always say is Timpson's, but there were others. Who were training, recruiting staff, organising, because it didn't, what I don't want, what we used to have was lots and lots of woodwork classes and things, which are complete, I'm afraid there isn't much demand for woodwork nowadays. What you want is actually properly organised training that might give somebody a skill that'll get them a job when they leave, and a working environment that's like a working environment, like it's an 8-hour day.
So properly paid?
It's got they're not properly paid in the sense of what you can afford. I mean, we're not paying them the minimum wage. They're not paid very much because they're prisoners, and I justify that because it's extremely expensive to lay on work in prison. So the overheads of the business are not really comparable with the overheads if you're running the same business in the high street. So we can't pay. We can't start paying a competitive wage. We pay a wage, and take some compensation for victims out of the wage as well. But what we're not short of prisoners who want to do it, because there are prisoners who, it's obviously a more sensible way of spending the time than bored out of your skull in the cell, but also there are prisoners who basically are wanting to settle down when they get out and try to avoid coming back, and you try to getting them in the habit of working and giving them some sort of experience of employability. And we were holding big conferences and all kinds of meetings with perfectly well-known high street, I'm sure Marks and Sparks have started yet, but really quite well-known firms were interested. And if there's one thing that would increase the prospects of a guy not sticking to crime, not getting back into trouble and coming back again, is if he settles down with a job, a flat and a girlfriend, and you're on your way, really, and I can't do much about the girlfriend. Job and a flat, we can do.
Okay, is it the gentleman there?
My name is Shamsul Arifin. I'm a magistrate serving on Birmingham branch. What's your view on short-term prison sentence? And do you think the prisons serve as a deterrence, given the fact that some of them are far more comfortable than you will find hotels on this street?
Not many. Which prison do you have in mind?
One in Redditch, open prison.
A Redditch open prison, there aren't many people in there. And open prison's often used after they've been inside when you're preparing them for release. Brixton's Napoleonic. It's complete myth that they're all, if that's a holiday camp, thank God I never went to Butlins. The reaction of people when they get to prison, and sometimes you get middle-class prisoners who are, it is...
MPs.
I mean, they deserved it, but the MPs, I must have found it a sort of nightmarish experience to find themselves in a prison. It's only anybody here gets convicted, and probably about as 1 in 4 adult males have a criminal record, but probably 1 or 2 here have been inside. You brace yourself for a very nasty experience when you turn up. It is a complete mythology, with great respect. That they're more comfortable than hotels. I've been to some bad hotels, but nothing as bad as Winson Green in Birmingham. Certainly not. And the difficulty is the worst ones. They vary a lot, of course. There are ones, more modern ones, better conditions. But the worst ones brutalise the inhabitants. If you want to put your feral in the class in prison and get them tougher and more dangerous when they come out, you put them in some of our prisons, and they meet some nastier friends than they've had before. They get introduced to drugs. About 1 in 10 of the people who take heroin first took heroin when they were encouraged to buy it in prison. Give it a go. They're nasty places. And those MPs, who quite rightly were sent to prison, I think probably had a traumatic experience. And short sentences are suitable for they're amongst the people for whom short sentences are suitable. If you have a middle-class professional man, some businessman who's engaged in a bit of fraud, and some MP who's fiddled his expenses, won't go on giving examples of some current ones at the moment, some 1 or 2 journalists looking in a bit of trouble. You don't need to send them to prison for 5 years. The first 6 months will sort them out. They're not going to want to get back again.
Gentleman there.
Sorry. So I'd just like to ask a question on the matter of Europe. There's been a lot of fringe meetings at conference dedicated to one side of the question, I think. And what strikes me is that historically, at least, the party has done more than any other party to integrate the country with Europe. At what point and what trigger do you think caused the party to almost become blind to reason on the European question, which is certainly how I see it a lot of the time, because I think that I'd go as far as that. And do you think there's anything that could kind of bring us back from the brink and perhaps be more reasonable on the question?
Well, I don't think, but firstly, let me make it clear, I don't think the party is blind to reason on the subject. I wouldn't be in the party if it was. I've no doubt that there are members of the party who are blind to reason on most subjects, and no doubt some of my friends think I'm blind to reason on 1 or 2, but that's just a matter of opinion. No. We have moved from being, as you quite rightly say, the party of Europe, because the Liberals were always pro-European as well, but the Conservatives being in office actually took the party into the European Union and actually developed our role in the European Union. Margaret led a very pro-European government, and then it changed after that. It's a very interesting question. People have written books as to why the balance of opinion changed.
Was it last
Two things. It was the fall of Margaret. I think what I regard, one day, I went to 2 recent party conferences, not suit place to dilate on it. The Conservative Party's unfortunate civil war, which put us out of office for so long until David Cameron came along, was the reaction to the fall of Margaret. It was a traumatic event, and it did funny things to the Conservative Party, I think, which we're slowly emerging from. And then otherwise, of course, although I normally deny that newspapers are hugely influential, and I always encourage my colleagues not to read them if they upset them, the change in the newspapers was dramatic. The Telegraph was the Bible of the Conservative Party. It was everybody at a party conference read the Telegraph. It was the loyal Tory newspaper, and it was edited by Bill Deeds, and it was pro-European, and it was one nation, and it was fond of remembering the Empire and a few other things, but it was the Telegraph. It was the rock bottom of the Conservative Party. And Conrad Black bought it, who was a ferocious anti-European, who wanted us to join the North Atlantic Free Trade Area. And he hired journalists and he hired editors to campaign on it. And Rupert turned up, and great respect to your proprietor, hates anybody who doesn't speak English in the European Union because they won't let his television stations in. And he bought the Times and the Sunday Times and all this bit. The Daily Mail was edited by a guy called David English, and was almost as powerful as the present editor. I knew David English. David English was pro-European, and his paper very pro-European. And then he got replaced by the present editor, who I get on very well with actually, but on Europe, he and I like chalk and cheese. And the Daily Mail is now ferociously, has been for years and years and years, under Paul Dacre, is ferociously Eurosceptic. So the fact that the Conservative Party generally was having a bit of a nervous breakdown following the fall of Margaret Thatcher, which they all persuaded each other had been some sort of conspiracy and all this kind of thing. And Margaret got more and more Eurosceptic when she'd lost her leadership of the party. And the ownership of all the right-wing newspapers changed, and they all got bought or edited by real Eurosceptic zealots, has had a very marked effect on the drift of opinion,
I think we're out of time, actually.
But I don't think that, the pro-European, I would encourage you to stay on board, really. It just, all my sensible Eurosceptic friends had to put up with years of being in the minority, and now I have to put up with being in the minority. There is sensible pro-Europeanism and sensible Euroscepticism, and I happen to think that sensible opinions still account for the opinions of 80–90% of the Conservative Party.
Well, thank you very much. I think Ken Clarke's never one to mind being in a minority.
Prefer being in a majority, like most Conservatives.
Thank you very much for spending the time with us. It's fascinating.